When P. Diddy and Candace Combs, a black couple, come to celebrate their 10th anniversary, Walter, the prejudiced restaurant owner, throws them out. Walter discovers their true identity, however, too late to make amends. Why does Walter have to confront the reality of his behavior? Before we get into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Walter Carter stood close to his restaurant's entrance, looking out over the evening patronage with the same astute observation that he had developed over the years. The Astorian was more than just a fancy restaurant. It was a representation of Walter's prosperity. Located in the upscale neighborhood of Buckhead, Atlanta, the Astorian was renowned for its fine French food, faultless service, and an ambiance that exuded elegance. After Walter had developed the restaurant's reputation from the bottom up, the city's elite now frequented it. Politicians, celebrities, lawyers, and business titans all entered, lured by the promise of seclusion and an unparalleled eating experience. Walter prioritized preserving the restaurant's reputation. From the immaculate white tablecloths to the expertly placed floral centerpieces on every table, every little detail was important. The ambiance was enhanced by the subtle sound of classical music playing in the background and the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers that filled the area. Walter took tremendous pride in making sure that only a particular kind of customer entered the restaurant, which was designed to radiate luxury. Walter was a distinguished individual. Wearing a crisp suit that was perfectly made and silver hair that was combed back, he exuded power in his early 60s. His posture was perfect, his features were crisp, and his demeanor was always cool and collected. His affluence was apparent in his demeanor, as well as in the way he looked. He felt that his restaurant's exclusivity was a reflection of his success and was proud of what he had accomplished. But beyond that well-polished facade was a man who had strong opinions about who should and shouldn't be at his establishment. Walter was cautious not to show overt racism, but his views were known to those who knew him well. He took great satisfaction in his ability to draw nuanced conclusions about others, frequently from their behavior, looks, or background. He was adamant about maintaining the Astorian as a haven for respectable people. This implied that those people he considered unsuitable for his establishment were subtly but consciously dissuaded from coming back. That night, Walter stood at the door when he saw a pair coming towards the eatery. The woman was wearing a gorgeous red dress that flowed gracefully as she walked, and the male was dressed immaculately in a fitted black suit. Their attire was elegant, refined, and perfectly suitable for the eatery. But as they approached, Walter's eyes narrowed. P. Diddy and Candace Combs were a black couple. Walter's smile wavered for a second. It was a subtle reaction, one that most people would have missed. However, it was a clear indication of his displeasure to those who knew him. P. Diddy Combs was a man who walked with a composed assurance. His hair was chopped short and well-groomed, and his skin was the color of rich mahogany. Candace walked with confidence and elegance beside him. Her eyes gleamed with warmth and intelligence, and her dark hair provided a lovely frame for her face. They were a remarkable duo, a representation of achievement and grace. But their race was more important to Walter than anything else. He wondered right away if they would match the image he had so meticulously built up over the years, and if they would belong in his restaurant. Walter faked a grin and gave P. Diddy and Candace his customary polite greeting as they arrived at the door. "Good evening," he remarked in a polished and easygoing voice. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "Yes, we do," P. Diddy smiled in return. "It's under the name Combs." Walter nodded, but he was already forming opinions in his head. He couldn't help but wonder if they had somehow gotten past his meticulously monitored reservation system, or if their reservation had been an error. He offered a barely noticeable nod to his maître d', who was standing a few paces behind him. After swiftly consulting the reservation list, the maître d' turned back to Walter with a nuanced expression that verified the reservation was, in fact, valid. Walter answered, "Ah yes, Mr. Combs," without revealing his thoughts. "Right this way, please." Walter couldn't help but notice the looks of some of the other customers as he escorted P. Diddy and Candace through the restaurant. They were the typical customers, rich, mostly white, and used to a particular ambiance. Some diners arched their brows while others exchanged glances that suggested mutual comprehension. Walter understood their thoughts since he was also wondering, why were P. Diddy and Candace in this place? The unstated, meticulously cultivated air of exclusivity that Walter had laboriously cultivated was upended by the couple's arrival. He led them to a table in the rear, away from the dining room's center and near the kitchen doors. Walter had set aside that table for patrons he felt were less attractive, people who didn't quite match the stereotype of what he thought his restaurant stood for. The placement was purposeful and subtly sent a message. Walter motioned for them to sit as they got closer to the table. He said, "Here we are," in his usual courteous manner. "I hope you enjoy your evening with us." Candace and P. Diddy glanced at one another, but remained silent. P. Diddy pulled out a chair for Candace before settling in himself as they took their seats. Walter stayed a moment longer, examining them critically. He observed how calm they were and how they carried themselves with grace and dignity. Walter, however, only saw what he wanted to see: two individuals who, in his opinion, didn't belong in his restaurant, instead of admiring their elegance. Candace said, "Thank you," in a quiet but forceful voice. "We're looking forward to it." Walter gave a brief nod and turned to leave, but the couple was still on his mind. He was unable to get rid of the uneasiness that their presence had evoked in him. Their confident demeanor contradicted his previous assumptions, and it wasn't simply that they were black. P. Diddy and Candace appeared completely at ease, as though they belonged there as much as anybody else. Walter pulled the maître d' aside at the door and muttered, "Watch them. Ensure that everything is managed properly." The maître d' gave a sympathetic nod. "Of course, Mr. Carter." Walter went back to work, still thinking about P. Diddy and Candace. He couldn't deny that they made him feel uneasy, even though he didn't like it. He was uncomfortable with the couple for some reason, and that discomfort just strengthened his resolve to take charge of the situation. Walter continued to stare at them as the evening wore on, searching for any clue that might explain his uneasiness. However, Candace and P. Diddy were calm, if not composed. Seemingly oblivious to the scrutiny they were subjected to, they conversed in low tones while periodically glancing at the menu. This supper was meant to be a memorable occasion for P. Diddy and Candace. They had been looking forward to celebrating their 10th wedding anniversary. In addition to the Astorian's stellar reputation, they felt that their achievements and diligence merited recognition in such a setting. They had seen the restaurant in upscale magazines and had heard about its exclusivity. They saw it as a prize for their accomplishments, a haven where they could unwind and spend quality time together, away from the stresses of everyday life. However, they could feel the tension in the air as soon as they walked through the door. They observed as Walter led them to a table that seemed strangely out of place in such a classy setting, and how his grin fell short of his eyes. They had experienced subtle racism before. They had already experienced it in many forms and locations. Nevertheless, they had anticipated that this evening would be different, that they could just enjoy themselves without the difficulties that frequently accompanied being black in settings where the majority of the clientele were white. Candace reached across to hold P. Diddy's hand as they sat at the table. She whispered, "It's a beautiful restaurant," as she looked around the space. Despite being able to perceive Candace's silence, P. Diddy nodded. "It is," he said, giving her hand a light squeeze. "Let's make the most of it." Even though they were both aware of what was going on, they chose not to let it spoil their evening. They had long since learned how to deal with such circumstances, how to overcome the slights and microaggressions that seemed to follow them everywhere. They were to be the focus of tonight's celebration of their love and the life they had created together. Walter's narrow-mindedness would not deprive them of that. Walter's disdain became increasingly apparent as the evening wore on. As though he were waiting for P. Diddy and Candace to do something that would validate his prejudices, he noticed that he was looking at them more frequently than he ought to have. However, they did not give him anything. They behaved immaculately and treated the personnel with the utmost class and grace. Everything Walter held about who should and shouldn't be in his restaurant seemed to be called into question by their sheer existence. P. Diddy and Candace maintained their composure, but they were acutely conscious of the animosity that was simmering beneath the surface. They saw how other guests would gaze in their direction and then immediately turn away, and how the waitstaff appeared reluctant to approach their table. Every action they took seemed to be scrutinized for some fictitious flaw, as though they were being watched and assessed. However, rather than responding, they maintained their composure and resolved to deny everyone the gratification of witnessing their discomfort. Walter, meanwhile, was still struggling with his contradictory ideas. He took pride in upholding a facade of civility and professionalism, never letting his biases show through. However, he couldn't help but believe that, just by being there, P. Diddy and Candace were somehow undermining his authority. He was angry with them for upsetting the carefully manicured image of his restaurant, and for having the audacity to behave as though they were welcome in a setting that he believed was exclusive to members of his class. At the Astorian in Buckhead, the evening was already underway. At tables, diners sipped expensive wines and enjoyed delicate delicacies that were prepared with the utmost care while conversing softly over clinking cutlery. The sound of cutlery clinking on china and conversational murmurs created an atmosphere of elegant peace. Walter Carter felt that everything was in order, everything but Candace Combs and P. Diddy's presence. For some time now, the couple had been sitting there, waiting for their food to come. P. Diddy and Candace had followed all the rules. They had booked their reservation well in advance, showed up on time, and behaved themselves in the most courteous manner possible. Walter's annoyance, however, was simmering beneath the surface. He couldn't get rid of the impression that they weren't welcome here, and that their presence detracted from the ambiance he had worked so hard to create. He was resolved to tell them that this was his restaurant and to regain control. Walter made a subtle yet calculated first move. While other tables received their meals immediately, he gave the waitstaff instructions to hold off on serving P. Diddy and Candace's dinner. The appetizers served by the pair arrived noticeably late. Candace and P. Diddy looked at one another but remained silent, preferring to sip their water and talk quietly. Even though they were aware of the delay, they chose not to let it ruin their evening. Walter became increasingly irritated as the minutes passed. He had anticipated that P. Diddy and Candace would feel uneasy about the delay, maybe even start grumbling. However, they maintained their composure despite the blatant disrespect. Walter was even more irritated by this poise. With their composure, he thought they were making fun of him and subtly disobeying the unwritten norms of his business. A server eventually brought the appetizers to their table after what seemed like a lifetime. The young man, conscious of the tension in the air, appeared anxious as he put the dishes down. The waiter had complied with Walter's explicit directive to his employees that P. Diddy and Candace would not receive the same standard of treatment as the other guests. The server put the food on the table and said, "Sorry for the delay," without making eye contact. "No problem," P. Diddy smiled politely in response. "Thank you." The waiter gave a short nod and stepped back, keen to get out of the awkward position. Walter observed from the other side of the room as P. Diddy and Candace started eating, his thoughts racing. They were too cool and collected. Something more straightforward that would make it obvious they were not wanted here was what he needed to do. Walter leaned near his maître d' and whispered, "Please double-check their reservation. Verify that it's authentic." Sensing the underlying animosity in Walter's request, the maître d' hesitated for a moment, but he knew better than to question his employer. He bowed modestly and said, "Of course, Mr. Carter," before rushing out to execute the command. The maître d' returned a few minutes later to verify that the reservation was legitimate. Walter was filled with rage. He had been waiting for a reason, any excuse to go straight up to the couple, but he couldn't just eject them without making a scene now that their reservation was confirmed. Walter, however, did not give up lightly. Walter decided to confront the couple directly, because he was determined to establish his dominance. After putting on his best grin and straightening his suit jacket, he approached their table. When he came, P. Diddy and Candace looked up, their faces reserved but courteous. Walter said, "Mr. Combs, Mrs. Combs," in a pleasant but slightly condescending tone. "I trust you're enjoying your evening so far?" Candace said, "We are, thank you," in a cool, collected tone. Walter responded, "Good, good," and nodded gently. "I wanted to personally make sure you were satisfied with everything. Here at the Astorian, we take great satisfaction in offering a remarkable eating experience. Therefore, I would hate for anything to be out of place." Walter's remarks had a faint undertone that implied something about P. Diddy and Candace was, in fact, inappropriate. The inference was immediately clear to the pair, but they declined to believe it. P. Diddy stated, "Everything has been fine," in a steady voice. "We appreciate your concern." Walter's grin grew strained. Even though he sensed they wouldn't be easily intimidated, he wasn't prepared to concede. "I couldn't help but notice," he added in a sharper tone, "that your reservation seemed to have caused a bit of confusion earlier. We don't often come into such peculiar situations." Candace's eyebrow went up. "Unusual circumstances?" Walter smiled unflinchingly and nodded. He paused and then said, "Yes, well, we don't often receive reservations from, guests who are new to our establishment." Candace and P. Diddy looked at each other. They weren't going to give Walter the satisfaction of reacting, even though they understood exactly what he was implying. P. Diddy, on the other hand, answered with the same cool civility he had displayed throughout the evening. "We made the reservation through the same process as anyone else," P. Diddy explained. "I'm sure it was no different from any other reservation you've received." Walter's annoyance increased. They remained too calm, too unflappable. He had anticipated a response from them, a justification for him to use more force to establish his authority. Instead, they maintained their composure and refused to react to his provocations. Walter responded, of course," as his voice became more tense. "I only wanted to confirm that everything was in its proper place. You are aware, of course, that we must uphold certain standards here." "We understand," said Candace calmly, "and we value your attention to detail. We decided to celebrate our anniversary here because of that." For a brief while, Walter's smile wavered. He was unaware of the fact that they had brought up their anniversary. He briefly contemplated retreating and allowing the situation to settle, but he was too proud to do so. He wasn't going to let P. Diddy and Candace enjoy their evening without telling them that he had decided they didn't belong there. Walter stood up a little. "That's good to hear, but I have to admit that I'm shocked you picked the Astorian for this important event. It's not the kind of spot where you usually find your kind of customer." The weight of their meaning caused the words to dangle in midair. Walter made a direct reference to their race for the first time, and he kept a tight eye on their responses, anticipating a moment of weakness. Candace and P. Diddy, however, did not recoil. P. Diddy, on the other hand, leaned back a little in his chair and looked serious. "Our type of clientele?" P. Diddy reiterated in a steady voice. "And what type would that be, Mr. Carter?" For a brief period, Walter paused, aware of the trap that was set for him. However, he had already gone too far and was too determined to give up. At all costs, he had to take back control of the situation. Walter added, "We cater to a very specific demographic here, with deliberate word choice. Our visitors anticipate a particular ambiance and degree of exclusivity. You may not fully comprehend the essence of our establishment, in my opinion." The thinly veiled insult Walter had been building to all evening was there. At last, he had expressed what he had been thinking ever before P. Diddy and Candace entered the room. They didn't belong here, in his opinion. He also wanted them to be aware of it. There was stillness at the table for a moment. P. Diddy and Candace looked at each other once again, their conversation going unspoken. Then P. Diddy spoke without averting Walter's gaze. "I see," P. Diddy said. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Carter." Walter couldn't quite place it, but something in P. Diddy's tone unnerved him. Instead of the fury or even indignation he had anticipated, he received a cool acceptance. P. Diddy seemed to have foreseen this clash and was just waiting for it to happen. Candace steadied her sight and leaned forward a little. In a stern yet courteous tone, she added, "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Carter. However, I can guarantee you that we are well aware of the nature of your establishment. We decided to eat here for that reason. We were anticipating a memorable evening spent together." A glimmer of doubt flickered through Walter. He felt uneasy because of the way they spoke and the serene assurance they exuded, but he dismissed the doubt in a flash. Since he owned the restaurant in Buckhead, he had the last word over who was allowed inside and who wasn't. Walter added, "I'm afraid I must insist," in a progressively icy tone. "This isn't the place for you, in my opinion. Your departure would be ideal." Before Walter could stop himself, the words were out. He was aware that he had gone too far, but now there was no going back. He was resolved to follow through on his position, which he had made plain. For a while, P. Diddy and Candace sat quietly, allowing Walter's comments to fully register. Then P. Diddy got to his feet carefully. Candace did the same, her face composed but determined. Although they were both aware that they might have intensified the conflict further, they also agreed that it was not worth it. There was no place or time for a fight here. Walter refused to perceive them as anything but dignified, despite the fact that they had been treated with contempt, even degraded. Walter felt a pain he couldn't quite place as they collected their possessions. Was it remorse or uncertainty? He swiftly pushed the emotion aside, telling himself that he had done what had to be done, even though he wasn't sure. He had safeguarded his restaurant's reputation and ensured that only the proper kind of customers ate there. P. Diddy remarked, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter," in a firm voice. "We won't trouble you any further, but remember this. People will always show you who they really are, one way or another." Candace's eyes remained fixed as she nodded in agreement. In a courteous but strong tone, she added, "Have a good evening." Walter stood there with his hands clenched at his sides as P. Diddy and Candace turned and left the restaurant. Pretending not to notice what had just happened, the other diners, who had been observing the altercation with differing degrees of interest, promptly went back to their meals. However, the tension in the room persisted, a persistent uneasiness that persisted long after P. Diddy and Candace had left. Walter went back to work with a collected face, but he couldn't get rid of the feeling that he had messed up. There would be repercussions for his actions, a tiny voice in the back of his head warned, and this night would come back to haunt him. Walter, however, pushed the voice and the uneasy emotions that went with it to the back of his mind. He was victorious. All that mattered was that he had defended the integrity of his establishment and exercised his power. He told himself that. Walter, however, understood deep down that this was far from over, a place he hardly ever let himself admit. He had started something that was out of his control, and although he wasn't aware of it yet, what happened this evening would alter his life in ways he never could have predicted. The text was formal and to the point. "Greetings, Mr. Carter. We are writing on behalf of a customer who has shown a strong desire to buy your chain of restaurants. Our client, a well-known investor with a sizable portfolio in the hospitality sector, is ready to make an offer that we think would meet your needs and expectations. Our customer has asked for a private meeting to go over the terms and conditions of the acquisition because of the delicate nature of this transaction. To set up a time that works for you, please get in touch with our office as soon as possible. We eagerly await your swift reply. Regards, et al., Mitchell Stevens and Company, Andrew H. Mitchell." With a gentle smile on his face, Walter read the letter twice. The idea of making a good profit on the sale of his network of restaurants was undoubtedly alluring. He didn't have any urgent intentions to retire, although he had thought about cashing out at a busy time before. This offer seemed serious, even unusual, based on the tone of the letter and the standing of the legal firm. However, one particular feature caught his attention. The investor's identity was kept a secret. Walter was curious about the source of the offer, but he thought it was a ploy to keep the talks private. Was it a rival trying to grow, or maybe a rich businessman trying to get into the gourmet dining business? He was captivated by the possibilities. Walter quickly contacted the law firm and set up a meeting for the next day, deciding that this was a chance worth taking. He hung up the phone with a rush of anticipation. If the offer was as generous as the letter indicated, this could be the deal of a lifetime. Walter showed up the following day at the law firm's office, located in a high-rise in Buckhead, also Atlanta's biggest financial district. A tribute to the firm's success and the richness of its clientele, the foyer was entirely composed of polished stone and glass. After greeting Walter, a well-dressed receptionist led him to a top-floor conference room. With windows extending from floor to ceiling, the space was roomy and provided a broad perspective of the metropolitan skyline. The area was dominated by a huge polished table with cozy leather chairs on either side. As always, Walter arrived early and paused to enjoy the elegance of the scene. A guy of taste, someone who appreciated the better things in life, was something he had always taken pride in. He liked this location because of its subtle grace. It was the type of setting where millions of dollars were exchanged, where influence and power were subtly used. Walter let himself think about what life may be like after the sale while he waited. He might purchase a penthouse in New York or a home in Atlanta, which would allow him to travel more. If he wanted to, he might establish a new company, increase his portfolio, or engage in other endeavors. The promise of such freedom was enticing, and the possibilities were limitless. Walter turned in anticipation of seeing a senior partner from the law firm, or even the enigmatic investor himself, as the door to the conference room opened. Rather, he was confronted with a scene that chilled him. Candace Combs and P. Diddy Combs stood at the doorway, both immaculately dressed in fitted business suits. Walter's mind briefly had trouble processing what he was witnessing. A wealthy investor who matched his ideal of what a powerful deal-maker should seem like was what he had anticipated. The pair he had rejected at his restaurant in Buckhead, Atlanta, a few days prior, were the last people he anticipated seeing. And yet, there they were, serene, composed, and radiating a tranquil assurance. "Mr. Carter," P. Diddy remarked in a polished and easygoing tone, "I appreciate you coming. We value the time you invested in our meeting." Walter blinked, his normally composed demeanor briefly faltering. "Mr. Combs." Combs, Mrs. Unable to find the right words, he trailed off. I wasn't expecting." Candace took a step forward, her face hard but courteous. "Please, Mr. Carter, take a seat. We have a lot to talk about." Walter, still in astonishment, found himself moving robotically and sat down at the table. He was seated right across from P. Diddy and Candace. As they were getting settled in, a group of solicitors and financial advisors arrived with briefcases and bulky documents. They positioned themselves on either side of P. Diddy and Candace, highlighting their dominance in this scenario. As everyone sat down and opened their documents, there was a brief period of silence. Walter's thoughts raced, trying to figure out what was going on. How was this possible? How could these individuals, whom he had written off as irrelevant and inappropriate, be sitting here getting ready to negotiate a $1 million deal? P. Diddy finally broke the silence. "I'm sure you're wondering why we're here today, Mr. Carter. Let me clarify." His eyes remained steady as he leaned forward a little. "My spouse and I are business owners. We have a sizable portfolio in the hospitality sector, which includes a number of upscale eateries. We weren't only celebrating our anniversary when we visited the Astorian the other night. We were considering purchasing your establishment as well." Walter felt the floor give way beneath him. In actuality, they had been assessing him, but he had assumed he was dealing with just another outcast couple. For a brief period, he found it difficult to remain composed as the realization struck him like a kick to the belly. P. Diddy continued in a cool, collected tone. "We took some time to consider our options following our meal at your restaurant. We've determined that your other businesses, like the Astorian in Buckhead, Atlanta, would be a great asset to our portfolio. We are coming today to present you with an offer." "Yes," Candace replied in a professional tone. "We're willing to pay far more than market value to buy your whole chain of restaurants. We think that both sides will gain from this deal." Walter looked at them, his mind still reeling from what had happened. It was illogical. Given how he had treated them, why would they want to purchase his restaurants? More significantly, why did they agree to pay more than the going rate? A catch had to exist. P. Diddy made the decision to explain after noticing Walter's bewilderment. "We're offering you a great deal because we think these businesses have great potential. However, for the deal to proceed, certain requirements must be fulfilled." "Conditions?" Walter's voice was tight and reverberated. P. Diddy responded, "Yes," as he leaned back in his seat. "First, the sale needs to be finished right away. This process shouldn't take months to complete. We anticipate you to have the resources necessary to complete the transaction as soon as possible." "What else?" Walter inquired, attempting to seem impartial. Candace stated, "The second condition," her eyes meeting Walter's, "is that you depart in silence. You will leave the company completely after the sale is finalized. There will be no interviews, no public declarations, and no ongoing involvement. You'll just take your earnings and go on. You will agree never to open a similar establishment again," P. Diddy said at the end, his voice becoming more stern. "You will not, under any circumstances, compete with us. We will consider it a breach of contract and take legal action if you do." Walter's poise broke at this. Instead of a hostile takeover, he had anticipated a simple business deal. The terms they were outlining felt like an assault, a conscious effort to deprive him of his heritage and identity. He could feel his temper building, but he made himself remain composed and use common sense. "Why these conditions?" Walter's voice was taut with emotion that had hardly been repressed when he inquired. "Why do you want me out so completely?" Candace and P. Diddy looked at each other, and then P. Diddy answered, "Mr. Carter, let's just state that we think it's important to conduct business with integrity. Your treatment of us the other night made it clear to us who you are, and we don't want to be affiliated with that mindset. We are providing you with a highly profitable path out, but it is contingent upon your total disengagement." P. Diddy and Candace looked at each other as they left the Astorian in Buckhead, Atlanta. Words weren't necessary. They were both aware of one another's thoughts. In addition to being embarrassed, they had noticed Walter's vulnerability, anxiety, and insecurity. things he had not wanted to show. They also understood that Walter would ultimately be held accountable for his deeds. They had a plan, a means to transform this humiliating night into something far more significant. They had the means, the contacts, and, above all, the determination to finish it. For the time being, however, they discreetly left the past behind and entered the future, which would be extremely different for Walter Carter and the Astorian. The fight was only getting started. Walter Carter had largely forgotten the awful evening at the Astorian, which had occurred a few days prior. He had persuaded himself that he had managed the matter effectively, that he had kept those who didn't suit his carefully manicured image out of his Atlanta-based restaurant. P. Diddy and Candace Combs were little more than a short, regrettable interruption to Walter. He thought his life and business would go on as usual, unaffected by what had happened that evening. But when one least expects it, life has a way of making things different. The eatery had a calm morning. Normally, the quiet murmur of conversation and the clinking of fine china filled the dining room. But now it was silent and deserted. Walter was reviewing the weekly reports in his office. His thoughts were on the routine details of managing his company. He took delight in keeping an eye on every little detail and making sure that nothing was left to chance, making his restaurant a well-oiled machine. Walter's assistant knocked on the door and came in carrying a neat envelope while he was going through the documents on his desk. The assistant, a young man named Charles, was usually calm, but today his voice had an odd hint of interest. "Mr. Carter," Charles said as he handed Walter the envelope, "you received this morning. It has an urgent label." Walter accepted the envelope and looked at it with a faint frown. The hefty paper was embossed with a delicate design that conveyed sophistication and richness. Walter recognized the prominent law company that sent the return address as being connected to important financial transactions and high-profile clientele. "Thank you, Charles," Walter remarked, waving his hand to dismiss the helper. When he was alone, Walter opened the envelope cautiously, curious to see what was inside. A letter printed on elegant stationery with the letterhead of the legal business at the top was inside. Walter had a moment of outrage. They have no right to judge him. They didn't know him, they didn't know the image he had to keep up, and they didn't know the difficulties he was under. However, he saw that there was no need in disputing when he observed P. Diddy and Candace. They knew they had all the cards now. Walter was unable to resist, though. "And if I refuse, what happens then?" When Candace answered, "If you refuse, we'll walk away from this deal and we'll make sure everyone knows exactly why." Her face remained the same, but her eyes were steely. "Your clients, investors, and the media will all learn about your treatment of us. And believe me, Mr. Carter, that kind of narrative gets about quickly in the modern world." Walter felt a knot in his stomach. He was aware of her correctness. He could lose all he had worked so hard to build, including his future, his business, and his image, in a scandal like that. Everything would be in danger. Although the realization was unpleasant, it was unavoidable. His own acts had cornered him, trapped him. There was nothing he could do to stop the same couple he had written off as unimportant from taking everything away from him. Walter sat in silence for a long time, thinking about his alternatives, his mind racing. He realized it would be pointless to try to compromise. Candace and P. Diddy had prepared, and they had no intention of giving up. Even as it hurt to realize it, he knew he had no choice but to accept the way out that they were offering him. Walter reluctantly nodded at the end. "Fine," he responded in a resigned tone of voice. "I'll accept your conditions." P. Diddy's lips formed a tiny, contented smile. "Great. After our solicitors complete the necessary papers, we can proceed with the transaction." Candace's gaze softened a little as she nodded in agreement. "Mr. Carter, you're making the proper choice. All parties will benefit from this." Walter remained silent. He was hesitant to talk, for fear that his resentment and rage would show. Instead, he merely indicated his agreement by nodding once more. As the conference went on, the attorneys reviewed the contract's specifics and described the sale procedure. Walter's mind was still spinning from the shock of the incident as he listened in a fog. It seemed unreal, as though he were witnessing the events of another person's life. But there was no getting away from the fact that everything was real, too real. The agreement was virtually finalized by the end of the meeting. Within a week, the last documents would be signed, and then all would be finished. Walter would leave with a sizable fortune, but at the expense of all that had made him who he was and everything he had fought for. P. Diddy held out his hand to Walter as he and Candace got up to go. "Mr. Carter, I appreciate your cooperation. We'll make sure the changeover goes smoothly." Walter gave him a formal, stiff handshake. "I'm sure you will," he responded in an emotionless voice. Candace nodded courteously at him. "Mr. Carter, goodbye. We hope your future endeavors are filled with success." They then departed the room, closely followed by their legal team. Walter sat and gazed at the table before him. Anger, contempt, regret. All of these emotions swirled around inside him. However, there was another, darker element as well: terror. Walter Carter felt genuinely helpless for the first time in his life. He had always taken great satisfaction in being in charge and directing his own course. But now he understood that he had come to this point because of his decisions and actions. He was solely responsible for his actions. Walter realized that his life would never be the same as he sat there in the deserted conference room in Atlanta. In addition to losing his business, he also lost his pride, dignity, and sense of self. Furthermore, there was no way to reverse time or repair the harm. Everything he had known had been upended by the turn of events that had brought P. Diddy and Candace into his life, and he was now lost in a strange and unfriendly world. Accepting the repercussions and trying to find a route forward, though he had no idea what that path may be, were his only options at this point. Walter Carter felt the weight of his own insignificance for the first time in his life. He had always felt superior to those he denigrated, though his wealth and influence made him untouchable. However, he now realized that a person's decisions and how they treated others ultimately defined them, not their wealth or position. Walter was aware that his decisions had brought him to this point, which was one of harsh realization, failure, and capitulation. Walter felt the chilly breeze sting his skin as he walked out of the legal firm in Atlanta and into the busy city streets. Pulling his coat tightly around him did not much lessen the chill that had crept into his bones. As he returned to the restaurant that was still his for a short while longer, the city shifted around him, unconcerned with his predicament. Walter, however, was aware as he went that the world he had once controlled was disappearing and that he was powerless to stop it. After the conference, Walter Carter strolled back to the Astorian in the fresh fall air that felt cooler than normal. His head was spinning with contradictory ideas and feelings. Being decisive and knowing what he wanted and how to obtain it had always been a source of pride for him. Now, however, he felt genuinely adrift for the first time in his life. At least in terms of money, the offer from P. Diddy and Candace Combs was everything he could have ever imagined. They were giving him an amount that would guarantee his retirement and enable him to spend the remainder of his life in luxury, far above market value. On paper, no rational individual would turn down the offer. But for Walter, it wasn't that easy. The warm lighting, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of conversations welcomed him as he walked into the restaurant in Atlanta. Ordinarily, these items would have made him feel proud of what he had created and accomplished. They just served to remind him of what he was losing today, though. Walter withdrew into his office and shut the door. He settled into his leather chair and gazed at the articles lauding the success of his restaurant, the certificates of achievement, and the framed pictures on the wall. These represented his life's work and the legacy he had built over the years of perseverance and hard labor. He felt pressured to accept a bargain that threatened to take everything away. His mind kept returning to P. Diddy and Candace, to the recollection of that evening, the evening he had insulted them, dismissed them, and finally ejected them from his restaurant. He had felt that his acts were justified, even righteous at the time. However, those deeds had now returned to haunt him in ways he could never have predicted. It was nearly intolerable to consider losing his restaurant to the same folks he had disregarded. It was about his identity and pride, not simply the money. Walter had spent years building a reputation for himself as a wealthy, powerful, and influential guy who was respected and admired. No matter how accomplished or wealthy they were, selling his restaurant to a black couple seemed like a betrayal of everything he had worked so hard to achieve. However, there was no denying the financial motivation. It was a generous offer, more than generous. He and his family would never have to worry about anything again, thanks to it. Walter, however, was caught between two strong forces as he considered his options, his pride and his greed. The more he considered it, the more he saw how much his pride had been hurt. He had always regarded himself as superior to those he worked for, those he served, and most definitely those he viewed as outsiders. It was unacceptable to think that those strangers would take over what he had created and make money off of his labors. But what option did he have? Walter rubbed his temples and reclined in his chair, trying to process everything. His partners and investors were putting increasing pressure on him. When he had alluded to the offer, they had been excited about it, viewing it as a lucrative chance to cash out. The racial undertones that made things more difficult for Walter were unknown to them. For them, this was just another commercial transaction, an opportunity to make a huge profit. Walter was aware that they would be appalled if they discovered the truth and realized how deeply ingrained his prejudice was. They had always regarded him as a shrewd businessman who made choices based on profit and reason rather than bias. Walter, however, had dedicated his life to cultivating his image, concealing his genuine emotions behind a facade of professionalism. He had never shown anyone his disdain for people who didn't match his ideal of who should live in his world. But now he was losing everything because of his intolerance. His biggest challenge today sprang from the very attitudes he had grasped so dearly. Walter wasn't yet prepared to laugh at it, but he could sense the irony in it. He was distracted from his thoughts when his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Richard Foster, one of his investors. Richard was one of the first people to support him and trust in his idea for the Astorian. The message was brief, but it was obvious. We must speak. This is a chance that we must not let pass. Richard wanted to talk about something Walter knew. The investors' patience was wearing thin. They couldn't understand Walter's hesitation because they saw the deal as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to profit from their investment. They had faith that he would bargain on their behalf and get them a deal that would work out for everyone. Walter, however, was aware that they might begin to doubt his judgment if they discovered his genuine misgivings. He still couldn't bring himself to be completely honest with them. Rather, he had been evasive in his answers, emphasizing the necessity of meticulous negotiation and the significance of precisely defining the conditions. However, it was getting more difficult to defend the delay as the days went by. Walter could feel the walls closing in on him as the pressure increased. Long after the restaurant had closed that evening, Walter sat by himself in his office. The lights were lowered, the workers had gone home, and the quiet was nearly deafening. Pouring himself a tumbler of whiskey, he gazed at the city lights below the window. As it went down, the drink burned, but it didn't do much to calm the chaos inside of him. He was aware that he had to decide quickly. It was going to get harder the longer he waited. But it was about who he was and who he wanted to be, not just about money or pride. Walter had always considered himself to be a guy of principle, someone who would never compromise on his convictions. However, the same convictions were now being put to the test in unexpected ways. Walter sat there thinking back on what he had done. He reflected on the innumerable occasions he had harshly handled, discarded, or criticized people because they didn't conform to his limited worldview. He had always defended it to himself by claiming that he was preserving his reputation and safeguarding his company. For the first time, though, he started to wonder if their explanations had been worthwhile. Had it been worth it for his pride? He couldn't get the question out of his head. Walter had always thought that his success demonstrated his superiority, that his wealth and position demonstrated his superiority over others he denigrated. But now that he was in danger of losing everything, he couldn't help but question whether he was mistaken. He felt uneasy at the concept. It was simpler to hold on to his old convictions and convince himself that he was correct and everyone else was mistaken. Walter, however, sensed in his heart that something had changed. He wasn't sure he was prepared for the confrontation, but the events of the previous week had compelled him to face aspects of himself that he had long disregarded. Walter met with his investors the following day. They assembled in the restaurant's private dining area, which is often used by upscale customers. As they debated the offer and each investor considered the possible advantages, the atmosphere was strained. Richard Foster was, as usual, the most outspoken. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for," Richard said with joy in his voice. "After years of developing this brand, we finally have the opportunity to sell at the highest level. We would be foolish not to accept it." With enthusiastic grins, the other investors nodded in agreement. They recognized opportunities to pay out and move on to their next endeavors. They had faith that Walter would guide them and help them make the best choice. They were getting impatient, though. They sought clarification. Walter nodded in agreement as they discussed their points of contention. He knew where they were, and accepting the offer made great financial sense. However, his uneasiness increased as the conversation went on. He had the unshakable impression that there was more at risk than just financial gain. Richard finally turned to Walter, his face full of anticipation. "So, Walter, what's the delay? You haven't said anything. Do you intend to accept the offer or not?" Walter paused, trying to find the appropriate words. He was aware that he couldn't wait much longer. The investors expected him to make a decision. However, as he glanced around the room, he realized that none of them really understood what he was struggling with. For Walter, this was something far more profound than what others perceived as just another economic transaction. In an attempt to calm his voice, he cleared his throat. "I understand your concerns, Richard, and believe me, I see the value in this offer, but there are complexities that we need to consider." Richard's eyebrow went up. "Complexities? What complexity?" Walter paused once again. He could not be honest with them without exposing the bias that had influenced so many of his choices. Rather, he attempted to present it in a businesslike manner. "The purchasers have specific requirements. They're demanding that I completely walk aside because they want total control. According to one of the other investors, that's normal in a deal like this. It's standard procedure for the new owners to want a clean slate." Walter said, "Yes, but it's more than that," with deliberate word choice. "They want me to leave, out completely, no participation, no remarks in public. They want me to vanish." Richard scowled. "What's wrong with it too? Walter, you've been in charge of this business for years. Perhaps it's time to relax and take it easy." Walter was irritated for a moment. They said it with ease. This was not a company they had started from scratch. They hadn't put all of their effort into it. He recognized they had a point, though he wanted to fight back. For the sake of the restaurant, he had sacrificed his personal life and worked non-stop for years. Perhaps it was time to relax. However, letting go meant surrendering, and Walter couldn't bear that. In the back of his mind, Walter knew the world in Atlanta was moving forward, indifferent to his personal struggles. But he was still struggling to make sense of his choices, not just the business deal that had forced him into this predicament. He was still under pressure from the investors to accept the arrangement. They emphasized the financial advantages, the flexibility, and the security it would offer. Walter, however, made a choice that went beyond financial considerations. It had to do with pride and the legacy he would leave. Walter felt the pressure of their expectations mounting on him as the conference continued. They had faith in him to guarantee their future, safeguard their investments, and make the right choice. However, they were unaware of the whole story. They had no idea how much it would personally cost him to complete the transaction. When Walter returned to his office after the meeting, he was more torn than ever. He was aware that he had to make a choice quickly, but doubt always got in the way of his attempts to consider it. The prospect of losing his restaurant, his pride and pleasure, to P. Diddy and Candace Combs was nearly unbearable, but the financial inducement was too wonderful to pass up. For the following 3 days, he was constantly agitated, mentally reviewing the specifics and searching for a way out. However he chose to view it, he was unable to deny that his prejudice had brought him to this moment. None of this would have occurred if he had shown P. Diddy and Candace the deference they merited that evening. However, he hadn't, and he was now suffering the consequences. The internal struggle tore at him, distracting him throughout the day and keeping him awake at night. He was unable to concentrate. The choice hung like a threatening fog over him. He was aware that he couldn't wait much longer. The strain was mounting, and the investors were becoming agitated. However, a knot of bitterness tightened in his chest each time he considered signing the contract. Why should a single error force him to forfeit everything he had worked so hard to achieve? Since P. Diddy and Candace didn't deserve to be in his universe in the first place, why should he allow them to win? Walter, however, knew in his heart that this was not the right way to think. He was aware that his pride and prejudice had too long blinded him. He had always believed that he was superior to other people, and that he was more deserving of achievement than anyone else. But now that he was in danger of losing everything, he understood that his conceit had been the cause of his failure. The internal conflict grew more intense, dragging him in many directions. On the one hand, he wanted to maintain his dignity, turn down the offer, and keep his business at all costs. However, he was aware that this was going to be a lost battle. In any case, he ran the risk of losing everything: his future, his business, and his reputation, if he turned down the offer because it was too good and the pressure was too high. The days flew by, each one bringing him one step closer to the final choice. Walter was uncertain about whether to jump or cling on for dear life, as though he were perched on a precipice. The idea of jumping in struck him with fear, even though he knew he couldn't remain on the edge indefinitely. Walter had made up his mind after what seemed like a lifetime. He would accept the offer, he would take the money from the sale of the business and attempt to start over. Although he knew that was his only choice, it was a terrible pill to swallow. He couldn't let his pride ruin everything because it had already cost him so much. To complete the papers, Walter met with his solicitors and the Combs legal team the following week in Atlanta. As the specifics were worked out and the paperwork was ready for signatures, the procedure was quick, almost mechanical. Walter sat silently, scarcely paying attention, while the lawyers went over the clauses and worked out the nuances of the agreement. Walter paused for a little period before signing the documents. His fingers were shaking a little as his pen lingered over the page. He sensed the gravity of the choice and its weight bearing down on him. But now there was no going back. He had to accept the decision he had made. Walter inhaled deeply before writing his name on the dotted line. His fate was determined when the ink flowed smoothly and left a strong black mark. It was finished. The transaction was completed. Following that, Combs' legal team worked quickly and effectively to make sure everything was in order. As Walter watched them work, he experienced a peculiar sense of disinterest, as though he were seeing the end of someone else's life rather than his own. However, it was his life, and it was now irrevocably changing. P. Diddy and Candace gave Walter a courteous thank you once the documents were signed. They exuded an inexplicable sense of quiet satisfaction, as though they had achieved their goal and were prepared to move on without any signs of triumph or gloating. Even though it was painful to watch them seize what had been his, Walter couldn't help but respect their poise. P. Diddy held Walter's hand again as the meeting concluded. "I'm grateful, Mr. Carter. He promised to take good care of the eatery." Walter shook his hand, his heart heavy, but his grip solid. His smile was forced. "I'm sure you will," he said. Candace gave a nod of consent. "We're looking forward to continuing the legacy you've built." Walter just nodded in response, since he didn't trust himself to answer. Their comments seemed hollow to him, but he knew they meant well. The legacy they talked about was now theirs and not his. Walter experienced a deep feeling of loss as he walked out of the gathering. Even though he had made the sensible choice, it didn't feel right. It felt like giving in to forces beyond his control, like defeat. It was, in a sense, he had been made to face the truth of his own shortcomings and the repercussions of his actions. He wasn't sure he would ever completely accept the painful lesson. Walter made an effort to accept his new situation in the days that followed. He convinced himself that he had made a wise business decision and that the money was worth it. But despite his best efforts to persuade himself, resentment persisted. He had lost his dignity, identity, and sense of self, things that were incalculable in monetary terms. Walter had spent years defining himself by his accomplishments, influence, and power. However, he now had to face the reality that his power had been based on conceit and bigotry, and that it had fallen apart beneath him. He had lived his entire life demeaning other people because he thought he was superior, wiser, and more worthy. But ultimately, he had fallen to his knees because of his own pride. Walter came to the realization that he had been fighting the wrong struggle all along, as he sat by himself in his empty office, the restaurant no longer his. P. Diddy and Candace, the investors, or even the deal itself, weren't the true sources of contention. It was with himself, with the person he had grown into, and the convictions he had so firmly clung to. Walter realized that the most difficult aspect was still to come, as he faced an uncertain future, facing the truth about who he was and who he wanted to be. And he had been avoiding that conflict throughout his life. More than anything else, Walter Carter would never forget the day he grudgingly gave P. Diddy and Candace Combs control of his cherished eatery, the Astorian. The legal paperwork, clean, formal signatures marked the end of one chapter for Walter and the start of a new one for Combs. They now owned what had been his pride and joy and the pinnacle of his career. There was no going back once the deal was done. Walter's fingers lingered for a brief second before releasing them as he handed out the last set of keys, trying to maintain his cool. P. Diddy and Candace took the keys with the same cool professionalism they had shown during the discussions. With the same gracious grins they had given him when they initially entered the restaurant, they thanked him. Walter, however, viewed their grins differently this time. They were victorious, not only courteous. Walter couldn't get rid of the sense of finality that hung over him as he left the office for good. He no longer owned the restaurant, which had once served as a representation of his prominence and fortune. Any sense of happiness he could have had from the money he had made from the sale was obscured by the realization, which descended upon him like a thick fog. He had committed to more than simply a company. He had signed away a part of himself. The sale of the Astorian was the buzz of the town in the days that followed. The abrupt shift in ownership surprised the local community, which had become accustomed to the restaurant's status as a mark of luxury and prominence. The rumor mill that flourished in the affluent circles Walter had previously been a member of helped spread the word about the sale. However, the transaction itself wasn't the only thing that made waves. That was the backstory. It spread like wildfire that Walter Carter, a wealthy and proud restaurant owner, had sold the entire business to a black couple after casually disrespecting them while they were dining there. The specifics of the altercation, including the icy looks, the covert taunts, and P. Diddy and Candace's eventual expulsion from the eatery, quickly became well known. People were both shocked and fascinated by the turn of events, and they discussed it in whispering tones. The narrative took on a life of its own and evolved into a warning against poetic justice, pride, and prejudice. With each recounting, the story grew more dramatic as it spread around the neighborhood. Some embellished, narrating the event with schadenfreude, enjoying the fall from grace of a guy who had always considered himself better than others. Others voiced sincere indignation, astounded that a well-known individual like Walter could have such antiquated and unpleasant beliefs. The sale's public announcement merely fueled the flames. The local newspaper published a headline that encapsulated the story: "Restaurateur sells business to couple he once spurned." The story described how P. Diddy and Candace Combs, who were both prosperous business people in their own right, had reversed Walter's situation and the events that resulted in the sale. The work depicted a man brought low by his own conceit and prejudice and a scene of comeuppance. The retaliation was immediate and brutal for Walter. Many of his previous clientele, who had formerly applauded him for his achievement, started to turn away. They had put up with his eccentricities and his insistence on upholding a particular image for his restaurant. But now that the reality of his actions was known, they had a different opinion of him. They could hardly ignore the bigotry that was suddenly visible and had always existed beneath the surface. Walter started to be treated like a pariah by the affluent customers who had previously frequented the Astorian. Social event invitations stopped coming in, and old acquaintances abruptly stopped answering his phone. Once praising Walter for his sophisticated taste and business sense, the individuals now murmured behind his back, wondering how they could have ever hung out with someone like him. Even people who held some of his opinions shied away out of concern for the damage to their own reputations. Walter's demise was not only social, but also monetary. He had made a substantial amount of money from the restaurant's sale, but it wasn't enough to support the opulent lifestyle he had become used to. As news of his actions spread, the other businesses he had invested in started to suffer. Fearful of being associated with a man whose reputation was now damaged, investors withdrew. Walter found himself with fewer and fewer options, as opportunities that had previously been easily accessible to him started to disappear. The public's response went beyond hushed tones and apathy. Walter started getting emails and letters from people who were disgusted and disappointed. Some were overtly antagonistic, while others were courteous but tough. Former workers who had previously been subjected to Walter's strict scrutiny opened up about the covert racism they had encountered while working at the eatery. They related tales of being passed over for advancements, receiving different treatment from their white co-workers, and putting up with Walter's patronizing comments. These disclosures further harmed Walter's reputation. As the allegations of his discriminating actions mounted, the story of his demise grew even more damning. The one instance involving P. Diddy and Candace wasn't the only one. There was now a pattern, an unavoidable history of bigotry. Walter was now viewed by the community, which had earlier hailed him as a prosperous businessman, as a guy whose wealth and prestige had concealed a pervasive prejudice. Walter tried in vain to restore his reputation. He made an effort to minimize the situation, claiming that it had been exaggerated and that he had only been upholding his restaurant's strict standards. However, nobody was buying it. There was no way to reverse the damage that had been done. His comments had lost their impact and sounded empty. Walter was left to deal with the repercussions of the community's decision. Walter became more and more alone as the months went by. The respect he once enjoyed vanished, and he was no longer allowed to join the social circles he had previously belonged to. His days were spent alone, reliving the events that had brought him to ruin and wallowing in his regrets. He was unable to avoid the harsh reality that he had arrived at this place because of his own pride and conduct. A continual reminder of what he had lost, the remorse tore at him. Walter always took pride in being a man of principles, someone who lived by his own rules. However, he now had to face the fact that his principles had been founded in prejudice and a sense of superiority, and that belief had cost him everything: his business, his reputation, and his position in the world. The Astorian was also significantly impacted by the sale's public backlash. The restaurant changed when P. Diddy and Candace Combs took over as owners. They offered a fresh sense of warmth and inclusivity that had been lacking under Walter's direction, while also upholding the high standards and elegance that had made the restaurant famous. The restaurant flourished in ways it had never experienced before, and its customers grew more varied, reflecting Atlanta's evolving landscape. The success of the Astorian under new ownership was an appropriate way to wrap up the story for the neighborhood. It was evidence that things might change and that outdated beliefs could be questioned and disproved. For many, the ultimate irony was that the restaurant, which had previously been a representation of exclusivity and elitism, was now a place where everyone felt welcome. Despite Walter's efforts, the exact thing he had tried to protect was now thriving. Walter's life diminished to a ghost of its former glory as the restaurant prospered. He turned inward, avoiding the people and places that brought back memories of his past. He wasn't really comforted by the money he had made from the restaurant's sale. It served as a reminder of his losses and was a meaningless victory. He lived far from the affluent area where he had previously resided, in a modest flat on the outskirts of Atlanta. Walter had plenty of time to think about his life, his decisions, and his convictions while he was alone. He reflected on the people he had harmed, the chances he had lost, and the pride that had finally proved his downfall. A profound, gnawing regret had taken the place of the hate and resentment that had formerly driven him. But regrets were too late. Walter was left behind, a holdover from a different time, since the world had changed. He was now viewed by the community that had previously admired him as a warning about the consequences of allowing pride and bigotry to run amok. Furthermore, Walter saw no means to make amends or repair the harm he had caused. All Walter had left at the end was his pride and his regrets. The legacy he had planned to leave behind was permanently damaged, and the restaurant he had once put his heart and soul into was no longer his. It was his own deeds, not misfortune or circumstance, that had cost him everything he valued. The results of his choices had materialized in front of him, leaving him with a life devoid of purpose and meaning. Previously wealthy and powerful, Walter Carter was now alone and despised by the town he had previously controlled. There was no turning back after the fall from grace was complete. The only things left were the awareness that his own hubris was the cause of his demise and the recollection of what might have been. Walter realized that he had learned the lesson too late as he sat in his empty flat, surrounded by the relics of a life that had lost all meaning. He was now suffering the price because he had not evolved with the world. When P. Diddy and Candace Combs owned the Astorian, it was transformed beyond recognition. The restaurant's previous reputation for exclusivity and snobbery was abandoned when they rebranded it. Regardless of background, race, or status, everyone was made to feel welcome at the Astorian. P. Diddy and Candace realized that genuine elegance was about fostering an environment of warmth, inclusivity, and respect for everyone who entered their doors rather than about excluding people. The adjustments made were modest but effective. A more modern and varied aesthetic was reflected in the updated design, which combined the restaurant's timeless charm with modern elements to create an opulent and welcoming atmosphere. Additionally, the menu changed throughout time, showcasing a greater range of meals that honored other cultures and tastes. P. Diddy and Candace thoughtfully planned every element of the dining experience to make guests feel important and loved. As soon as word got out about the change, the restaurant began drawing in more customers than it had in the past. Attracted by the Astorian's stellar reputation and dedication to diversity, people from all walks of life came to experience it. As the traditional barriers of race and class were dismantled in favor of a more open and accepting atmosphere, the restaurant came to represent positive change in the neighborhood. Under P. Diddy and Candace's direction, the business grew. The restaurant's earnings skyrocketed, and both reviewers and customers gave it consistently positive evaluations. Reservations were frequently made weeks in advance as it became a popular spot for business meetings, parties, and anniversaries. In addition to maintaining the restaurant's history, P. Diddy and Candace had been successful in taking it to the next level. Walter Carter, now living in obscurity, watched from the sidelines as P. Diddy and Candace prospered. In the world that Walter had previously controlled, he was now only a spectator. From a distance, he kept up with the Astorian's success by reading the overwhelmingly positive newspaper reviews and talking to locals about it. Every story and reference to the restaurant's recent success served as a sobering reminder of what he had lost. Walter devoted his days to introspection, mentally reliving the events that had brought him to ruin. He reflected on his choices, the pride he had held onto, and the ingrained biases that had eventually cost him everything. In addition to costing him his business, racism had also denied him the chance to develop personally. And this realization was terrible. Walter had held himself to a high level at the Astorian when he was younger. He had persuaded himself that these requirements were necessary to maintain the restaurant's reputation as upscale and exclusive. However, as he looked back on his previous behavior, he realized that it was really an excuse to keep out those he thought were worthless, and to maintain a sense of superiority that was out of place in a changing world. The same pride and elitism that had sustained his business had ultimately destroyed it. He was aware of the irony of his predicament. The very people he had written off as unfitting the image of his restaurant, P. Diddy and Candace, had turned out to be far more capable and visionary than he had ever been. They had improved upon what he had created, making it more in line with the ideals of a more diverse and inclusive society. By doing this, they had taught him what success and elegance really meant, which he had never really grasped. Walter's resentment gradually gave way to remorse as the years went by. He realized that the world had changed without him, adopting the inclusive and accepting values he had long opposed. The wealth he had accumulated did little to console him, and the pride that had previously defined him now felt empty. He had nothing to show for his years of toil, but recollections of what might have been. And he was isolated from the community he had once been a member of. Walter made the weak decision to go back to the Astorian. Maybe, he reasoned, he may find some comfort in going back to the place that had been his pride and joy. Enough time had gone by, he reasoned, and it wouldn't harm to check out the changes. He had been in charge of the restaurant's early success, after all. Perhaps, just perhaps, he could be able to connect with it once more. To make a reservation, Walter picked up the phone and dialed the restaurant. As anticipated, the voice on the other end was kind and businesslike. He introduced himself as Walter Carter and asked for a table for one the following weekend. After a moment's silence, Walter heard a reply that broke his heart. The hostess said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," in a polite but forceful voice, "but we don't have a reservation under your name." Walter was stunned for a second. Even though he had sold the business, he had fully anticipated to be accommodated and acknowledged as its previous owner. However, there was no attempt to create an exception, and the hostess gave no sign that she recognized him. To her, he was merely another patron, one of thousands who had made a reservation over the phone. Walter cleared his throat in an attempt to calm himself. "Would you double-check? You see, I used to own the restaurant." "I understand, sir," the hostess said, gently interrupting him. "However, we have a robust reservation system. Maybe you could go on another date." Walter sighed deeply as he hung up the phone after thanking her. The irony was obvious. He had no place in the restaurant he had formerly owned and run, where he had rejected P. Diddy and Candace. He couldn't be distinguished from the innumerable other names on the waiting list who wanted to eat at the newly renovated The Astorian in Atlanta. Walter eventually came to terms with his predicament as he sat in his tiny, unpretentious flat in Atlanta. The world had changed along with the restaurant, and he couldn't go back and get back what he had lost. In addition to taking over his company, P. Diddy and Candace accomplished what they had never been able to. They transformed it into a welcoming environment that exemplified the principles of respect and inclusivity. Walter could not deny that he had been responsible for his own demise. He had lost his business, his reputation, and his position in the world as a result of his prejudice. And now, without him, the restaurant that had once been his pride and joy was flourishing, a representation of all he had been unable to comprehend. Though harsh, the final irony was well earned. The same people Walter had rejected had destroyed the impression of exclusivity and superiority he had attempted to maintain. Ultimately, P. Diddy and Candace made the final decision, transforming the Astorian into something bigger than Walter could have ever dreamed. Walter was left alone in a world that had moved on without him, and all he had left were his regrets. Do you believe that P. Diddy and Candace made the right decision in purchasing the restaurant? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you for being a part of this journey.